In March 2024, Egypt did four things no country ever does voluntarily. First, they devalued their currency by 38%. Overnight, everyone's savings shrank by more than a third. Second, they raised interest rates by 600 basis points. That's financial code for "we are panicking." Third, they signed a new $8 billion deal with the IMF. That's the fund that only shows up when a country is already on fire. And fourth, they sold a huge chunk of their Mediterranean coastline to the United Arab Emirates for $35 billion. This wasn't a master plan. This was a collapse. And it didn't happen overnight. It took 10 years of bad decisions, a military takeover, and a few thousand miles of empty bridges. Here's how you destroy an economy without ever admitting you're doing it. To understand the collapse, you have to go back to July 2013. A general named Abdel Fattah el-Sisi took power in a military coup. The world didn't love the coup part, but they loved the stability part, especially the rich Gulf countries. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait sent $23 billion in aid over the next 18 months. That's not a loan, that's a gift. Three countries basically said, "Here's a blank check, don't mess up." But here's where the story turns. Instead of fixing Egypt's broken economy, instead of helping the 22 million people crammed into Cairo's slums, Sisi decided to build things. Huge things, shiny things, things that looked great on a poster, and things that would bankrupt the country. The first insane project was announced in March 2015. A brand new capital city, 45 kilometers out in the open desert, starting from literal sand. Cost? $45 billion. Timeline? 5 years. Spoiler alert, neither of those numbers turned out to be true. Here's what got built. The tallest building in Africa, right there in the middle of the desert. Empty. The Tyre Miser Bridge, widest in the world. Why? Because they wanted a Guinness World Record, not a joke.
And a 53-kilometer driverless train line connecting this empty new capital to eastern Cairo. It opened just a month ago.
Now here's what did not get built. Greater Cairo has 22 million people. Most of them live in working-class neighborhoods. Crowded, hot, no air conditioning on the trains that do exist. In 2019, experts identified Metro Line 4 as the single most important transit project Egypt could build. It would serve 1.5 million passengers every day. The poorest, densest, most transit-starved parts of the city. Where is Line 4 today? Still under construction, years away from finishing. So let's be clear. They built a driverless train to an empty city and ignored the train that millions actually needed. That's not bad planning. That's a choice. And honestly, that's not even the worst economic decision Sisi has made. The worst one is much, much darker. Because it involves soldiers and pasta and a secret economy that nobody is allowed to audit. Remember how Sisi took power in a military coup? Well, coups have a price. You owe the people with guns. So Sisi did something that sounds small, but turned out to be enormous. He handed over the entire economy to the military. Not just weapons, everything. The new capital city? 51% owned by the military. Those bridges? Built by the military? The pasta you buy at the supermarket in Cairo? Increasingly made by the military. Here's where it gets shady. The military runs an economic empire so secret that nobody actually knows how big it is. Sisi claims it's small, maybe 1.5% to 2% of the country's GDP. Independent researchers put the real number above 40%. That's a huge difference. And the truth probably lives somewhere in the middle, but closer to the scary number. These military companies don't pay taxes, no customs, no value-added tax. They use conscript labor. That's a fancy way of saying they force civilians to work for them for free. They get contracts without competition. And they're audited only by other military officers. So imagine you're a normal company trying to compete with that. You can't. In 2018, the military opened 2 new cement plants. International cement giants just left the country. Why bother? And this is where the real destruction begins. Because when foreign companies leave, they take something Egypt desperately needs: dollars. Here's a simple truth. Egypt's entire crisis is a dollar shortage. When a foreign company builds a factory, they bring dollars. They convert those dollars into Egyptian pounds to pay workers, rent buildings, buy supplies. The Egyptian central bank keeps those dollars. That's how a country builds reserves without borrowing money. But when foreign companies leave, those dollars leave with them. So what did Egypt do instead? They borrowed a lot. In 2013, Egypt's external debt was around $43 billion. By the end of 2023, just 10 years later, it was $168 billion, almost quadrupled in a decade. Now, borrowing money is fine if you invest in things that pay it back: ports, factories, things that create exports. But Egypt didn't do that. They built empty cities and widest bridges. Today, interest payments alone eat between 75 and over 90% of Egypt's total government revenue. That means almost every dollar the government collects goes straight to paying off past loans, not to schools, not to hospitals, not to roads that people actually use. So the currency started collapsing. The central bank tried to pretend everything was fine. They said officially that $1 was worth 30.85 Egyptian pounds. But you couldn't actually buy dollars at that price. Banks didn't have them. So a black market emerged. By early 2024, the black market rate hit £70 to the dollar, more than double the official rate. The head of the IMF put it perfectly. She said Egypt was putting water in a bucket that has holes. And then, ordinary Egyptians started feeling the pain. Here's what happens when your currency loses 80% of its value. Egypt imports almost everything it consumes: wheat, fuel, medicine, machinery. When the pound collapses, all of those things cost 5 times more than they used to. Not 5% more, 5 times more. And in May 2022, Sisi gave a speech that will go down in history. He said Egyptians should be willing, if necessary, to eat leaves from trees, for the sake of the nation's progress. Let that sink in. The leader of a country of 108 million people told them to eat leaves. That's not leadership. That's surrender. Now, everything we've talked about so far, Egypt did that to themselves. The mega projects, the military economy, the borrowing, the fake currency rate, all self-inflicted. But here's the cruel part. Just as Egypt's own decisions were destroying the economy, the outside world decided to pour gasoline on the fire. 3 external shocks. Egypt had no control over any of them. And one of them cut Egypt's single biggest source of cash in half, overnight. Shock number 1. A certain virus we all remember. Tourism collapsed from $13 billion a year to just $4 billion. That's a 70% drop. Egypt's beaches, pyramids, and temples sat empty. Shock number 2. Russia invaded Ukraine. Here's why that mattered for Egypt. Egypt is the largest wheat importer on earth, and 82% of that wheat came from Russia and Ukraine. Suddenly, the price of bread, the one thing every Egyptian eats every day, went parabolic. The government had to spend billions in emergency subsidies just to stop riots. And then shock number 3, the one nobody saw coming. October 7th, 2023. Hamas attacked Israel. Israel invaded Gaza. And the Houthis in Yemen started firing missiles at every ship going through the Red Sea. Within weeks, more than 2,000 vessels stopped using the Suez Canal. Instead, they sailed all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, an extra 6,500 kilometers. Now, Egypt owns the Suez Canal. It's a geographical monopoly, a machine that literally prints money because the alternative is that ridiculously long detour. In 2023, the canal generated $10 billion in revenue. In 2024, just $4 billion, a 61% collapse. In 1 year, because of a civil war in Yemen that Egypt had absolutely nothing to do with. So let's add it up. self-inflicted wounds plus 3 external gut punches. By February 2024, credit default swaps, that's Wall Street's way of betting on who will go bankrupt next, priced Egypt as the second most likely country on earth to default. The only country considered more likely to collapse? Ukraine, which was actively being invaded. Egypt was weeks away from running out of money. But then something strange happened. The world stepped in. Not because the world is kind, because the world was scared. Here's why Egypt couldn't be allowed to fail. 108 million people live here. When countries collapse, people leave. And where would they go? Europe. The Mediterranean Sea is right there, a few hundred kilometers north. Desperate people with small boats. Europe knows this. And Europe is terrified of another migrant wave like 2015. Also, the Suez Canal handles 12% of global trade. If Egypt collapses, that canal becomes a chaos zone. Global supply chains snap. So Egypt is, in the most cynical sense possible, too big to fail. Not because it's powerful, because it's dangerous. So the bailout came together. Fast. The lead donor? The United Arab Emirates. Probably not on anyone's bingo card. But here's the catch. The UAE's $35 billion wasn't really a donation. It was a real estate deal. A really bad real estate deal. For Egypt. Egypt gave the UAE development rights over 170 kilometers of prime Mediterranean coastline. Beaches, hotels, luxury resorts. In exchange, Egypt got $24 billion in new cash, plus another $11 billion of existing deposits converted into investments. The moment that deal closed, dollars came rushing back. And then, on March 6, 2024, everything happened at once. The pound was floated. It lost 38% of its value overnight. Interest rates went up 600 basis points. The IMF deal expanded to $8 billion. The World Bank threw in another $6 billion. And the European Union added $7.4 billion. 200 million of that was specifically earmarked for migration management. Europe was literally paying Egypt to stop boats. Egypt survived the week, but survival isn't the same as fixed. Here's what did not get fixed in March 2024. Debt service still eats between 75 and 90% of government revenue. Almost nothing left for schools or hospitals. The military still runs an estimated 40% of the economy. No taxes, no competition, no audits. The mega projects are still empty. The new capital is a ghost town. Those bridges lead nowhere. The population is still growing by 1.5 million people every year. That's a new Cairo every 3 years. The private sector is still being crowded out. Foreign companies are still leaving. And the Suez Canal? Still losing billions because of a war Egypt didn't start. None of that got fixed. It just got funded for another few years. So, here's the real ending. The one that doesn't make a good headline, but is probably true. Egypt is not going to collapse like Lebanon or Sri Lanka. Those countries were small. They were far away. Nobody cared enough to save them. Egypt is different. It's too geopolitically load-bearing. Too many people. Too much trade. Too close to Europe. So instead of collapse, Egypt gets what you might call a permanent slow bleed. Every structural problem that caused the 2024 crisis is still there. They just pushed the due date further out. The next shock will come. Maybe another war. Maybe another virus. Maybe a drop in oil prices from the Gulf countries that sponsor Egypt. And when that shock lands, it will land on the same fragile structure. Because here's the thing no one wants to admit. You can't destroy an economy in one day. You destroy it slowly. One bad decision at a time, one empty bridge. One secret military factory. One eat leaves speech. And once you've done that damage, no bailout can undo it. Bailouts don't fix broken systems. They just keep them breathing. The question isn't whether Egypt will crash again. The question is when. And what breaks with it?